the last 1 hour, we will discuss the telecom case study valuation, and there I'll bring those concepts like mid-year adjustment, stub fraction, and discount for lack of marketability, company-specific risk premium, and all of that. So we'll cover it in that example. So let's be back at sharp 2, and then we'll proceed further with this case. Right? Thank you. Let's get started. So please open this telecom file this, that we had discussed before. Please open the version number 4 of that. So it's the version number 4 of the telecom case study. Please open that. Prachit, minority interest concept I had discussed yesterday. So this is basically related to the interest. So file name Abhijit is the Day 2 small financial model version number 4. The file name is R04 IT networking. R04 IT networking. Yeah, coming back to you, Prachi. So we discussed this point yesterday that minority interest is basically the amount of the stake that I don't hold. That portion is basically deducted at the end from the net profit to arrive at the net profit attributable to the equity shares. So if there is a company in which I hold, let's say 85% stake, then the balance 15% that I don't own, I would need to deduct that from my net profit because that's not attributable to the equity shareholders of my own company. So we deduct that at the end. That it is treated like this. But the net profit of the 100% consolidated entity, subtract non-controlling interest, and that gives you net profit attributable to equity shareholders of parent company. What we typically do to arrive at profit adjusted for minority interest. Non-operating assets is basically any asset that we non-operating asset is basically any asset that is not meant to be used for the regular operations. Like if there is a company and it has parked certain funds in for purchasing shares of some other company, that is going to be a non-operating asset. Like a small amount I've put in to buy some shares of some other company, that is categorized as non-operating asset. All right. So Prachi, minority interest, we add minority interest while calculating enterprise value. The thing is, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to find out the valuation of the company, and valuation of the company should ideally cover only 85%. If I hold 85%, I don't own 100, then it should cover only 85%, right? Minority interest is actually subtracted at the top to be able to achieve or arrive at the net profit which I own, and then eventually I use it for the valuation. All right. Let us come back to this sheet now. I hope all of you have opened this file. This is PAR01 IT networking file. You're not clear. Okay. So the thing that I'm trying to say over here is that the portion of the interest that I don't own, I need to exclude it from my profit, because if there is an investment, there is a company in which I hold some stake, let's say 85% stake example that I'm taking here, and I don't own the balance 15%. So I can't include it in my valuation because I don't own it completely. I own only 85%, so I would include only 85% of it. So the balance 15% is actually a deduction which I do from the net profit. And when it comes to the DCF valuation, using any of the methods, I would need to pick the profit which is equal to the equity shareholders, excluding this non-controlling interest. We have to exclude it. Does this make sense? No, there is no adjustment. Using net profit attributable to equity shares, you've already deducted it, so we don't have to deduct it again or add or subtract it again. It is already adjusted out here while computing the free cash flows. Okay, now let's go to this file. So this file, we are going to financial synopsis of the DCF valuation. Though we have already covered a detailed DCF model in the camera manufacturing case, here I just do a synopsis of it. And then the perspective here is to bring those additional pointers that we discussed before, that like what are the adjustments to be done in cost of capital. Okay, let me repeat it one more time. The file name is PAR04 itnetworking.xlsx. File that we discussed in the very beginning, which is the small financial case study. So please check the folder small financial model or small valuation. The valuation small folder. Please go to that folder, open this file PAR04 IT networking. Coming back to this, first I would like to just complete this by taking this how we can compute the free cash flows. Though we have already discussed the conceptual clarity behind this, why we do so. So I'm not going to spend time on discussing how to compute free FCFP. Now the way how we could compute the various parameters, or how we could actually capture the other parameters of valuation, right? I will come a little closer to the mic, Richie. I hope that helps. Just 1 second. I've got closer to the mic. Is that slightly better now? Okay. So let's get back here. So I was saying that let us pick this profit before tax, which is given here in the row above from row number 48. I'll capture that. And from there, we need to deduct the tax component to be able to arrive at the net profit. Or if you want, you can straight away start with the net profit line as well. It is one and the same thing. So it is 1 minus tax rate, which is given here. See, this concept, again, reiterating this fact, we have already discussed that in detail. So I hope and assume that all of you are now clear on the concept of free cash flow, so that we can discuss the cost of capital aspects in this example. what we do, we add back the depreciation and add back like in this subtract the interest. Like in this case, interest is not there, so I'm not going to be bothered about the interest component. But at least the non-cash component depreciation is taken here, and the capital expenditure and any kind of other capital work in progress, I'm going to deduct that. So this capital work in progress is not here in this example. It is only the overall capital expenditure, which we covers both the network related cost and also the cumulative additional capex during the year. And this row number 35 and 37. This indicates the amount of capital expenditure that this company is doing. That gives us the free cash flow to equity. This gives us the free cash flow to equity. So we've got the net profit, which is over here. Then we have added back the depreciation, then subtracted the capital work in progress, which is not there, and also the capital expenditure for the network access and additional equipment capex. So this is the total capex that we have spent in each of these years. We have subtracted it out here. That gives us the free cash flows to equity. Please note that when you take the sum, don't take the PBT again, because the next row already captures the PBT into 1 minus tax. So please make sure that you write the right formula here and capture only the first 3 rows. Once you have it, you can compute the terminal value by using the Gordon growth model, which is the terminal year cash flow multiplied by 1 plus growth rate, which is terminal growth rate, divided by cost of capital minus terminal growth rate. This is the logic that we use for computing terminal value, which is going to be equal to 239 into 1 plus terminal growth rate is given as 3% divided by cost of capital, which is given as 12 minus 3%. That gives me a terminal value of 736. Let's have a look at this formula. So the total cash flows would be the sum of these two. So please complete till this stage and then we'll move on. Over here, we have just computed the free cash flows to equity, and we are going to discount it at the cost of equity. A56 Venkat is this cell. K59 Y2975. It is basically adding the terminal year cash flow plus the terminal value. So we add both of them together, both of these items together, to be able to see the final free cash flow to equity, which needs to be discounted. Now, over here, there are a couple of things that we have to capture. One question that Abhinandan is asking is that what is the basis for the terminal growth rate? Like is it the assumption of a growth post the projection period? That's precisely right. That we have got the projections created for the next 5 years till 2024, but definitely we would be doing the business even beyond 2024. So we need to take certain growth rate, and that growth rate is the terminal growth rate, which is roughly about 3 to 4% for a company operating in India, because that's how you arrive at terminal growth rate. Now the other part, apart from computing the terminal value like this, what we can do we can use some sort of an exit multiple for terminal value. Sometimes there is an investor who puts in money, like an initial investor who puts the, or angel investor or venture capital money in the beginning of a project, in the beginning of the company's life. At that point in time, the investor is taking a amount of risk. So that person might say that I don't bother what is the terminal cash flow and terminal growth rate and all that stuff. I want to exit at a multiple of, let's say, 15 times. Right. So that person may state that this is the multiple that I need. That's technically called exit multiple. Now this exit multiple can be on multiple parameters, on various parameters. Somebody might say that this is basically the terminal value is going to be that EV to EBITDA multiple, based on EV to EBITDA multiple. So they would use EV EBITDA multiple and multiply this with the terminal period EBITDA. So what they would do, they would say that I need to see that what is the terminal period EBITDA, and on that I'm going to apply 15 times. Or somebody might say terminal value I'm going to compute as not as EV to EBITDA, but I'm going to look at, let's say, I'm going to look at the terminal period cash flow and multiply this with the exit multiple. If I look at the terminal period cash flow, the terminal cash flow, and multiply this with exit multiple, that gives me a value for terminal value. So what that person is saying, probably that person might say that I'm looking for a 15 times multiple. So 239 multiplied by 15 times, I'm going to ask for this multiple. I will exit at this price, right? So there could be a possibility that you simply take EV to EBITDA multiple or exit multiple based on terminal cash flow, or you use a model which is called, this is called Gordon growth model. Gordon growth model states that you look at the expected cash flows in future by considering what is the stable growth rate of the economy post the projection period, right? And then you count it at the cost of capital. But coming back to standard, which is available on the basis of which you arrive at it. So it is all dependent on what party does when the investment is being done. The person would say that when I exit, I'm going to apply a 15 times multiple and then apply it. Then compute the valuation to exit at that price. So there is no standard for an exit multiple, but at least for a terminal value using the Gordon growth, there is a standard. It says that you identify what is the stable growth rate, what is the cost of capital, and then compute it accordingly. Right? Usually, I would leave this part. Usually, there is a possibility that you could apply EBITDA based multiples, or you could apply the terminal cash flow based multiples. It could be anything. So you could find EBITDA into exit multiples. You could apply terminal cash flow into exit multiples. Somebody might say, I'm going to take EBIT into exit multiple. All of those things are agreed that this is the multiple at which I'm going to release. Right? So once you have these parameters, you can find out the equity value either by using the discounting that we know how to do that, but also in Excel we have this function called equal to NPV, which can be used to find out the present value of all the future cash flows. So the rate of interest, or the rate that I have to take over here, not the rate of interest, but the desired rate, is the 12% cost of capital, which I'm going to capture, and the values are given over here. So it gives you a final value of $1906 million, which is $1.9 billion for this. So NPV automatically is going to discount all of these values at a rate of 12% per annum, and then arrive at this value, which is going to give you the summation as 1906, which when applied over the shares that we have in this company, it is 1906 multiplied by 10 raised to the power 6 to give you absolute USD divided by the number of shares which are available in row number 23. That gives you the final share price per USD. But here you see that I've taken certain base assumptions like 12% cost of capital. I've taken the normal discounting, and that's the usual stuff that we typically do. First do it till this stage, and then we'll see what are the basic what are the basic adjustments that we can do over here to be able to account for all those factors that we discussed? Any doubts till this stage so that we can move on to that concept? The exit multiple can be based on EBITDA or it can be based on terminal cash flow. So it all is about that what is the multiple and what is the approach that you're going to finalize. Prachi, to your point, what if the company is expecting further round of funding? How do we account for that? If there is any funding that doesn't impact the equity valuation right now, because that happens at a later, and that gives you post money valuation. Because if in this company, let's say there is this $5 million which are expected, then valuation post money will be 2406, right? But if that happens at a later stage, only then the valuation goes up. But at the same time, the denominator also increases, like number of shares are also going to go up. So probably you will be very close to it. Right? Please, Prachi, go on.
Yes, thanks, Amardeep. So the question actually is that, say there's already an agreement with the existing shareholders to infuse funds, say next year and the year after that. And therefore the projections will account for this new equity funding coming and therefore growth that we are assuming. In that case, how do we do the valuation? Because if I take into account that extra growth, but not the equity to come in, later, then there's a mismatch. And if I don't take into account that growth, then I know that there is, for example, an agreement with the shareholders to infuse funds later. So how do you solve this question, basically? Thank you.
Still, the answer is the same. You don't adjust for equity even in that case. Let us understand why. We do the valuation by looking at the free cash flow to equity, and at any point in time, we not capture any equity infusion which is going to happen at a later stage. Number one, because here you see the free cash flow to equity doesn't take the equity infusion which is expected in this company. Even if there is any in the projection, still that's not going to be taken. Because how that happens in a startup company usually is that that's the situation wherein you have an agreement with the shareholders that they put money in the next 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. What happens in that case is there is a cash burn, which happens every year. Probably the net profit is negative or some sort of a huge amount of capex is required, because of which you see the negative figures, right? Just because those are negative figures, to be able to meet those expenses or meet those cash shortfall, either go for loan or you take equity. And when you take equity, it doesn't impact your net profit. Honestly speaking, your profit remains unchanged if the equity component has been raised. So at an overall level, your valuation is not going to be impacted on account of it. So any future equity infusion, despite the fact that it might have been captured in the financial model, is not going to impact your valuation today.
Right. So then should we still account for the growth, assuming that money is going to come in later at a later point? Is it fair to sort of use that in our assumptions today?
Very fair to do that, because if you don't take growth, then you're basically saying that your company is going to be stagnant and probably close down. The thing is that I'm going to say that my company grows at this much rate, and this is the kind of investment that I need. That is why I'm seeing this negative value in this, and now I need some extra cash. So they are going to put in this much of cash to allow me to keep my business going, right? So the point over here is that I cannot take the equity infusion as a positive factor right now. Actually, this is actually done as a decision. When you have a financial model in front of you, you use it to find out what is the amount of funding that I need, and that is how you agree with them. You show them the cash burn part, and then you tell them that in this case I need, let's say, I'm just assuming that the cash burn, let's say I would ask them that they put in 80 here, and say if it is minus 100, I will say that put 100 here, and if it's minus 13, I'll say put 13 here. So whenever there is a cash shortfall or there is a need of funds, only then you get the equity infusion, right? Or even if the expansion or a growth is considered, the profits go up to an extent, but at the same time, capex also goes up. So you don't have to adjust for it again by taking any equity component there. It may be there in the financial model. There is no problem with that. But in the valuation, that's not going to make any change. And Zayan, to your point, what about the dividend payment, buyback? Nothing is taken. Any payment to the equity shareholder is not captured. Even if there is a dividend amount expected to be paid in future, you don't deduct it here. If there is any buyback that is expected in future, you don't take it today, because today you still have the higher number of shares. And today you have not utilized that cash for buying back. It's not going to be taken in your projection. I mean, you can take in projection, but not in evaluation. Financing activity related to the equity part, yes, it's totally ignored. If you're using this FCFE, nothing is related to equity which needs to be taken out here. And Prachi, coming back to you, what about taking an additional debt? If you take additional debt, that will be captured here. But at the same time, what happens is that if there is a movement in the debt, then point is you also take debt as a positive number, but interest also comes in. Because for a debt, what happens is, let's say you're taking a debt, there is a positive figure of debt, and then you are repaying it to the extent of 20 every year. So you take that also into account. Then there is an interest also which you end up paying, let's say -10, -9, thing like that. So that component will be captured, because over there you have a repayment part also along with it. So if you're taking additional debt and there is a timing gap, you do the repayment and you also make interest payment. All of that would be captured, not in isolation. You take everything together out there. It is taken, then definitely the interest also comes in on that additional part. So I was just talking about the additional interest which is going to be included related to the new debt which is being raised by the company. Yeah, the current debt that we have in the balance sheet, that would definitely have interest, which automatically got deducted in the PBT part. All right. But Prachi, if you're using FCFF, then you don't do this adjustment. Here I'm saying that we are using FCFE. You use FCFF, then you don't take this adjustment. In that case, your capital structure keeps on moving, because there are thoughts around it that if the debt movement is there, then definitely this changes in the debt. You don't take it in the free cash flows, but the ratio, debt equity ratio, keeps on changing. So the weights also change. So the weighted average cost of capital should be different one for all of these years. See that many of the financial modelers and valuers, they tend to take a constant WACC, which technically is not right. And in fact, if you read this article on, there is an article by Swat Damodaran and is uploaded an Excel file also towards this end. He's saying that FCFE and FCFF both will give you the same rate or the same answer if you use consistent assumption, meaning you take varying weighted average cost of capital, then you would notice that it's going to give you the same result. Right. So there is a school of thought that people tend to take the fixed capital structure, that 40% debt, 60% equity. Let me compute back and use it all across the years. But logically speaking, if you want to remain consistent, the changes in the debt to equity ratio should be adjusted, and that will give you a different weight to be taken for different years. And you have different weighted average cost of capital which are used for the discounting purpose. That is the precise point that is explained in that article as well. This is how you get the same result from free cash flow to firm and free cash flow to equity. Otherwise, if you use a constant one, you would never ever get the same rate of the equity value. It is always going to be different. Right? That's the school of thought which explains that how you basically account for the varying debt levels. All right. There's a question around the equity, convertible instruments and expenses thereof. Now, convertible instruments would basically relate to the, let's say, some convertible instrument which is going to be converted to equity at a later stage. Now here, I would need to discuss a bit about the accounting standards to bring that part, because sometimes what happens is there is a 0.01% compulsorily convertible debt, right? Compulsory convertible debt which has been issued. That means that there is no interest that you're getting, and after 5 years, after 3 years, it is going to be compulsorily converted to equity. Now, on the face of it, the terminology is that it's a debt. But to be honest, this is going to get converted, the equity part. So here, what we do, we account for that conversion and increase the number of equity shares in the denominator to that extent. And hence, we take the diluted number of shares instead of the current basic shares outstanding. Right? We discussed about the concept of diluted equity shares and the option rollover in the M&A topic. So that comes into picture here. And in that case, we don't treat it as a debt component, we treat it as an equity because we know that it is equity in this 0.01% interest, which is like nominal. So it is actually the equity component only, which has been masked with a different name. Interest reduced in later years. Sorry, I didn't understand this question. Okay, when converted to equity, see, interest is usually 0.01% or something like that. Or if there is a lower interest rate, then what happens? There is a component which is taken as debt and the remaining component is taken as equity. There is some like-to-like basis. Let me explain it. There is a 1% compulsory convertible debentures which have been issued, and that is 100, right? So typically, what is the interest expense that you pay on it? Interest expense that you pay is just 1% of this, right? Which is 1. Now, market average rate of interest is, let's say, 10%. Let's say it is 10%. Now, this is something that we get as a relative parameter that the market average interest rate is 10%. So if I were to capitalize it, if I capitalize the interest expense at market rate, it gives me a loan of 10, which means that if you had taken a loan of 10, then at a market rate of 10%, you would have paid an interest of 1. So out of this 100, only 10 rupees is actually the debt component and 90 is equity. This is how we actually account for it. So, in this Indian accounting standards for Ind AS, what it says is that this 10 rupees you would take as debt and the balance 90 you will take as deemed equity, because it's actually a masking name given to it. And if it is a 0% CCD, then effectively the entire 100 rupees is going to be as part of your equity component. So we actually account for it. No, it doesn't. Cost of debt is just about a small portion. As I said, 10 rupees debt only is taken with a market rate of 10%. Because when you take the cost of debt, it doesn't mean that you are paying only 1. It is a compulsory convertible, right? If it was a non-convertible debenture, then definitely your cost of debt goes down because you don't have to convert that to equity. It is 1% and this is non-convertible, then it reduces your cost of debt drastically. But if it is going to be taken as part of equity, it's not going to reduce your cost of debt because it is taken as good as an equity component. As we just said, over there it is taken as part of your equity component. So once this gets converted, even this 1 rupee would go away. But as I said, there's 10 rupees anyways, which ways we are taking as debt. Yeah, please, Vishakhi, go on.
Yeah, hi, Mandeep. The thing I want to know is 1% is convertible, that I agree, but that 1% will have effect on my cost of debt as well as my debt equity structure, right?
That's what I'm saying here. See, out of this 100, as per that logic, out of the 100 CCD, only 10 is debt and 90 is equity.
Right.
Right. If 90 is equity, then don't look at this 100. This 90 is equity. That's not going to be taken as part of your debt at all. If you're using free cash flows to firm and you have to use the weighted average cost of capital, then you are paying, you're saying that it is 10 rupees debt and 1 rupees interest. It is 10% cost of debt. It's not 1%.
Okay, right? So you're saying the whole
assumed as equity.
Okay, so you're saying like from day one it will be considered as equity only, even before actual conversion.
From an accounting standpoint, accounting standards state this. This 90 rupees is basically a deemed equity.
Okay, but then
the thing is that company is just giving it a name of debt. In reality, it is not a debt.
Right. So in that case, my debt equity ratio would be like when I'll be considering it for WACC purpose, that time my debt
Yes.
equity ratio would be calculated in what way?
10 rupees is going to be taken as debt only, not 100.
Okay, fine. Okay, yeah, got it. Thank you.
Or let us proceed then. Now, what I was talking about, there was this question which was asked that how you basically account for the cost of equity and all of those adjustments. Like here in this example, I'm just going to pull the cash flows by taking certain scenarios. Say that this is the free cash flow to equity. Now, I want to capture some scenarios. This is year number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say these are the year numbers that we have got. What I want to do is, in fact, not like I have to split that into two parts. One is this one, and then I'm going to compute the terminal value separately. Over here, that gives me the total cash flows. So what I want to do over here is that here, let me just park certain assumptions. If the terminal growth rate is, this is scenario number 1. Let's say my terminal growth rate is, I have the inputs at the top, but let's still put it here for ease of reference. Let's say my terminal growth rate is 3%, which I've got, and the cost of equity unadjusted is 12%. Now, what I mean by adjustment, stub fraction, and all that stuff, let's cover that point. Let us begin with the mid-year adjustment and stub fraction. What is this mid-year adjustment to begin with? Mid-year adjustment states that usually when you do the discounting without the mid-year, you discount for it for the complete period, right? Complete period meaning this 83 is going to be discounted for complete 12 months period. So if I have a terminal value which I want to compute as this into 1 plus growth divided by 12% minus 3%, this is the typical value that you get, and then it's going to be this plus this to get the total cash flow. So what I typically would do that if I'm using NPV formula, that is that you discount this 83 for complete 12 months, you discount this 101 for complete 24 months, this 136 is for complete 36 months, and so on, so forth. But if there is a mid-year adjustment factor to be brought in, that propagates that this entire amount of 83 you don't receive at the end of the year. For this 101 you're not receiving at the end of the second year. Your 136 is not being received at the end of third year. Because if you discount it for 3 years, then you are saying that this 160.36 you're getting on the last date of that year, which is factually incorrect. So the mid-year adjustment is of the fact that instead of just discounting it for complete year, we need to assume that this 130 is being received across the year, and across the year means take the average, take the middle of the year, which means the first one. If I put period here, period with mid-year adjustment means you're going to take 0.5, which means that you're not going to receive it at the end of 1 year. You're going to receive it in the middle of the year. And if you receive it in the middle of the year, then you only have 6 months to bring it back. So 6 months is equal to 0.5 year. Second year, you are assuming that you will receive it in the middle of the second year, which means that there are 1.5 years for which you need to do the discounting. Third year, you're assuming it is in the middle of the year, which means that there are 2.5 years for which you do the discounting, and so on, so forth. This is called mid-year adjustment because it states that without this adjustment, you are basically ignoring the basic concept of the cash flows being generated during the year, because during the year needs to be accounted for, and that is going to be in this particular respect. Because if I have a monthly model, they'll automatically be taken care of. But typically, we don't have a monthly model. We usually have an annual model. We need to take certain assumptions that instead of saying at the end of the year, we are assuming that it is going to flow across the year, and that's what we are doing by taking the middle of the year adjustment. What we do here, if there is a middle of the year like this, I'm going to say that my discounting factor is equal to 1 divided by 1 plus 12% raised to the power 0.5, roughly about 0.94, and that's what I get as the discounting factor. So what I've done here is I've taken 1 divided by 1 plus cost of capital raised to the power n. N in this case is 0.5, 1.5, 2.5, and so on, so forth. So eventually, present value of cash flows is going to be equal to multiply by, and then you drag it on the right hand side, which gives you a total value of this. So this becomes your total equity value after including the mid-year adjustment. All right. So this is how the mid-year adjustment is going to come into picture, that it changes the period. And in case this was not taken like this, like what I've done right now, I've taken the previous year plus 1, and that's giving me the mid-year adjustment value. Just assume it was not 1. It was not 0.8, it was 1. Then it will become 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and see the result 1906, and that's it here. But the moment you change it to 0.5 with and all the values are adjusted, the mid-year adjustment is actually leading to a different result. It would be usually higher if the cash flows in the beginning of the projects are actually positive. If these are negative, it could have a different impact as well. But usually for positive numbers, you see that mid-year adjustment is going to lead to a slightly higher value. And that's pretty logical, because you don't everything at the end of the year. You see something in the middle, so we should not have discounted it for complete 12. So you do the lesser discounting for that adjustment. All right. Another adjustment which is very closely related to this is this stub fraction. Stub fraction. 90. Okay, here it is. It is basically taking the multiplication of these two. Another concept that is related to this is the stub fraction. Now forget about mid-year adjustment for the time being. Let's assume I have these data. Here, let me write scenario 1, mid-year adjustment. And here, I'm going to bring the values and now compute the terminal value like this, which is this into 1 plus growth this minus this. I've actually got the same table over here as well, but now instead of mid-year adjustment, there is another component or adjustment that I'm going to show here, that is stub fraction. Now what is the stub fraction? Let us say the period over here is not a complete year. Say it is you are trying to do a valuation right now. Today is 30th August and you want to do valuation as on a particular date. And one of the basic premise of valuation is that it is always a point in time exercise. You can't say that I've arrived at this valuation and it remains the same across the year. It's not like that. It is always a point in time exercise. And point in time exercise means that you take assumptions and data points applicable on that particular date. And if today I do the valuation and I take 30th August or 31st August as a first year, it is a partial year for us because we take the future projections. If my valuation date, let us assume, is 31st July. And here I have the start date and end date. So say my start date, the projection start date is 1st August 2020 and it is 31st March 2021. And this is how I'm getting the future dates. And here I have the start date. Let's say this is the data that I have. Look at this one. My projection start date is nothing but valuation date plus 1, because if I'm going to take the valuation date as 31st July, then going by the base logic of DCF, you need to take the future projection, right? So if I take the complete 1 year projection, that is wrong, because I don't have complete 1 year left in the first year. So I should ideally be taking it from 1st August onwards, because my valuation cutoff date is 31st July. So here we compute stub fraction, which is actually relevant for first year. It's relevant only for the first year, not for the subsequent year. It's relevant only for the first year. What it states is that what is the percentage of the first year for which you need to take the projections and everything. That we can compute, as I discussed in the model also when I was talking about the project finance. You take the stub fraction by considering the valuation date as a start date and the first year end date, which is 31st March, which gives you roughly about 66.7%. Like I've got 8 months which are active, and 8 months divided by 12 is 67%. That's the stub fraction. Now, how is this relevant? This is relevant if you know what are the projections for those 8 months, then you take only that much of data over here, right? If you're creating a monthly model, the first year you have the specifics as to what is expected to be the free cash flow to equity for the next 8 months, then take only that data, not the annual one. And in the absence of any data, if I don't have anything, what I would end up doing, I would actually be taking free cash flows to equity and I would multiply that with the stub fraction and then take this number here. So what I'm trying to say is that if in the first year, the complete 12 months, I'm going to have a negative cash flow of 83. That 83 is for complete 12 months. So just for 8 months, I would have 56 as negative number. But if you have the exact data, you have the model available on a monthly basis, then you can take better assumptions. If not, then the fair assumption out here is that you proportionate it, because it's 12, 83 for complete 12, and I need it for 8. Approximately 56 is the number that I should get, and that's precisely what I'm showing over here, which is nothing but the annualized number multiplied by stub fraction. So the first year over here, first year tends to be partial year. Either take projections data only for the partial year, or take annual number and multiply by stub fraction. The two choices that you have. Obviously, I would prefer the first one, but only when I have the monthly data available or I'm able to actually logically work out the data for August to March. If not, then I don't have a choice but to take the full year number, multiply by stub fraction. And what it means for us is that when the discounting happens, the period also undergoes a change, because now I've got only 8 months, right? Which is roughly about 0.66. So I'm going to start with this stub fraction and then add 1 to it. I'm going to start stub fraction, add 1 to this. Does this make sense? you've got this period, then the process is the same that we discussed before, that you do the compute the discounting factor, which is 1 divided by 1 plus cost of capital raised to the power n, which finally gives you present value and then the summation. So how you capture the stub fraction. And let's say you say that no, it is not going to be 31st July, it is 30th June. Then we have got 9 months, which is roughly about 75% of the period. All right. And if you would like to combine both mid-year adjustment and stub fraction, then instead of taking 0.75, I will take this into 50%, which is 0.375 to start with. Then you are kind of capturing both of them together. If you take the first year number, then it is going to be the 0.75 into 0.5, which is 0.375 to begin. All right. Does this make sense? Let me read a couple of questions which have been asked. Only difference is the application of accrued interest and nominal interest. I'm sorry, Dipankar, I cannot make any logic out of this statement. Which difference are you referring to? Because I'm not talking about the accrued interest or nominal interest concept here. Sorry, I'm not able to follow you. Can you please elaborate your question a little bit? Because we're talking about the adjustment to the period for the purpose of discounting. So it has got nothing to do with the accrued interest or nominal interest. Now in this discounting, we're talking about the cash flows period. Like in the stub fraction, we are saying we don't have the complete 12 months cash flows which we would receive. In the first year, we will receive only for the 8 or 9 months. So we basically adjust it accordingly. Like the first year is not a complete year that I take one. I would take only 9 months. So 9 by 12 is 0.75. Okay, great. Now, yet another question was asked around the adjustments that we do to the cost of equity. Now that adjustment, I would like to actually do it over here itself. So sometimes what happens is there are some adjustments around the company specific risk premium. Like if the base cost of equity is 12%, which is on the basis of some model, let's say CAPM model, is giving me 12% cost of equity. But what happens is when I look at the specific factors of a company, I get to understand that there is some additional risk in this company. And why is it so? It could be on account of multiple reasons. Let's take an example. I have some money as an individual investor. I have to decide where to park my money. And today I decide that if I have to park my money, then the moment I decide to put it in a startup, then there is an extra level of risk that I'm going to take, right? And if I take extra level of risk, then I should be compensated for it. And how do I get compensated for it? Let's have a look at it. I'm showing you modified cost of equity here. What it says is, let's say the pure cost of equity, which is adjustment, is 12%. Let's say this is what we have got with the help of CAPM model or something. What I see is that there is a company which is a startup company, and because of that company being a startup company, there is an additional risk that we are going to take. Now, how do I quantify that? There is a standard that can justify what is the objectivity behind taking any assumption, right? So for a startup company, if there is any company specific risk, CSRP as we usually call it, company specific risk premium that I need to take, you would see that in the valuation domain, valuers tend to use this term pretty often. So if there is a CSRP which to be taken, how do you take that? It ranges between 2% to 5%, but then if you ask me that what is the objective approach to arrive at 2% or 3% or 5%, there is no standard answer. It requires an informed judgment of the valuer, because that valuer needs to see that kind of risk that this company poses because of certain factors specific to that company. I should be adjusting it additionally for about 1 to 2%. There are some research reports which are available looking at the historical data who have actually shown some empirical evidence. We've got some empirical evidence which actually specifies that this startup company ends up giving a higher return in the longer run if it is a successful company. So maybe that can become a basis for us to bring that premium factor out here, right? But usually it is not a foolproof number. It is going to be taken as an action by the valuer. So usually it is roughly between 2 to 2.5% if you take it, or maybe 5% at max if it is too risky. But you would notice many a time that the venture capitalists of this angel investor, when they put in money, they tend to take a cost of equity of as high as 30%. So you know what they do? They basically take a CSRP of 10 to 15. What is the basis? They will say that we are putting money in 10 different startups, and I don't know how many startups are actually going to be successful. So they do the investment on the logic that if they are putting some money as a seed capital in the startup, then chances are it may be a successful investment or it may be a flop investment. But I don't know what is the way to be. So depending on the level of risk that I'm taking, I'm going to increase CSRP out there. So basically they take 10 to 15% CSRP, which would artificially reduce the valuation, and they get a higher stake for the same amount that they put in. So that even if at a later stage, out of 10 companies, 5 flop and 5 are hit, then those hit companies would help me recover the entire cost that I put in all of those 10 companies. That's the perspective in mind. So they look at the riskiness specific to a business, specific to the level that it is in, and then you arrive at this number. So let's say if I'm going to take 2% out here, I see a comment which has been put in the chat window is that it was 9% in case of India. No, it is not. Number one, it is not specific to India. It is specific to company. And number two, the Damodaran website was giving the equity risk premium, not the company specific risk premium. So equity risk premium is the standard one that you invest in this versus the risk-free rate. You typically get a higher return. So equity risk premium is you're putting money in the equity shares of the company versus putting that money in the risk-free asset, which is the Government of India bond. Then you definitely need to command some extra premium. That's what that equity premium is. But this one is company specific. That's just because this company is a small company, or just because this company is at a stage which poses so many challenges, and there is a huge risk element involved here because of the level or the stage at which it is in. All of those factors accounting together would help you take an assumption risk premium. On the top of it, these days you would notice that people are talking about COVID premium. Now that you need to consider by looking at a lot of other factors, because there is no agreement on that part, that whether the COVID premium should be taken as 2%, 3%, 4%, 1%. What is that we should be taking? There's no agreement on it, because there also the logic is that everybody is taking assumptions that we will have a U-shaped kind of a recovery, or we'll have a very drastic recovery after 2 years, 3 years. Everybody is taking his own assumptions around it. That's why they're saying that we need to take an extra risk to be captured in the cost of equity. Like very recently, I did one valuation. I also took it. To be honest, I took 2% COVID premium, but I actually took it in tranches. I said that I would take 2% premium for the first 2 years, and then I'll reduce it to 1% for the next 2 years, and then I'll make it 0, because I'm not going to take it to the terminal period, because considering COVID premium in the terminal value is equivalent to saying that we would never be able to get away from this problem, right? Because you're talking about the perpetuity period. So what I did, I basically took 2% in the first 2 years, then 1% in these 2 years, and then nothing in the 0 and the terminal, and nothing in the 5th year and the terminal period. So I ended up having different cost of equities which I used for different years. So I had one cost of equity which I used for the first 2 years, another cost of equity which was slightly lower for the next 2 years, and then third cost of equity which was even lower for the terminal period and also the terminal value company. On top of it, you would see that there are some factors like small size premium. Small size premium is there is a company in which I'm putting money and that's very small company. The chances are that if you compare two companies in the same industry, the chances are that a big company would be able to experience some economies of scale, be able to achieve some level of profit, but the small company, as compared to that other one, the smaller company might witness some sort of issues, be able to sustain in some difficult situations. So if I have, as an individual investor, if I have to put in money, let's say today you have to decide between putting your money for a long period in Jio versus Airtel versus Vodafone. Probably Vodafone would be the last choice for me because I see that it is a very small company today as compared to the other companies. And number two, I'm not too sure about the company specific factors out there. So if I have to do the valuation of Vodafone, I would rather be taking the company specific risk premium in Vodafone if I have to do this comparison with Jio or Airtel or some other company. Right. So this also tends to be a subjective parameter. Typically, this premium is also applied for a small for a startup company because when it is small, you account for the small size of the company, and usually if you are taking a company specific risk premium, you're automatically capturing a component to account for small size as well. This company specific risk premium is not only just for some other risks, the size of the company, whether it is a private company or a publicly listed company. Like for a private company, what happens? For a private company, today if I put in money, tomorrow after 5 years, 7 years, I might find it difficult to exit my investment because it is illiquid. And if it is illiquid, then what's going to happen? I might find it difficult to sell it off. Which means that if I get to invest my money in some other investment which is liquid and listed on the stock exchange, probably there is no illiquidity out there. I will be able to exit my investment at any point in time. So what happens is for a company which is private, not listed on stock exchange, there is an illiquidated discount which is applied. Illiquidated discount is you get a value of 79 and you're saying that 10% I'm reducing to account for this illiquidity. But again, what is the basis for that 10%? There is no basis for it. It's the subjective call. And a term very closely related to it is DLOM, which is discount for lack of marketability. It is basically one and the same thing if I have to put it in simple terms. It is that your investment is not marketable. You can't really sell it off to somebody else easily because it's private or because of some other factors. It becomes less marketable. So for lack of marketability, you need to apply certain discounts, so probably 10-20% reduction you can do here. But nowhere we have any objective parameter to capture why only 10, why not 15, why not 20. There's no standard for it. It all is the judgment of the valuer, and that comes definitely from the experience. If the person has been valuing a lot of companies, both the publicly listed company and the private company, that person will be able to state that usually there is a gap of about 10 to 15% in terms of valuation. So let me just apply that 15% DLOM over here. Another one is DLOC, which is discount for lack of control. Now, all of these terms, to be honest with you, look pretty good and nice if you look at theory in books, but practically it is very hard to apply. And I personally don't apply any of them. If I have to share my opinion with you, I just apply the CSRP, and that to a certain extent. The maximum CSRP that I've taken is 5% because it was for one of the startup companies wherein the money was coming. So I use that CSRP of 5%. Otherwise, this illiquidated discount, DLOM, DLOC, etc., I don't cover. I don't take it. So lack of control means that you're having a small stake in the company. So you don't have control. So for your stake, you don't really get any benefit, because if I was holding a controlling stake, I would have been able to apply some sort of a premium because I take the decision. I can take the decision as per my requirement. But because I don't hold control, the valuation actually goes down just for the stake that I hold. But if you hold the controlling stake in that company, then you don't have to basically take it. Now, back to your point, why I don't take it. Usually, what happens is when you do valuation, you take these assumptions, and there is no objective method to justify it. Because if I take, let's say, a discount for lack of marketability of 10%, and tomorrow, after a year or so, let's say there is a query which comes from the regulatory authority. So, we do valuation for both internal purpose and also for the purpose of aligning to the legal requirement. Like whenever there is an equity infusion which happens in India in a private company from outside, the RBI states that as per the FEMA, Foreign Exchange Management Act, you need to get the valuation done. So when you do the valuation and you apply some DLOM or DLOG, what is going to happen? That tomorrow if the RBI is going to scrutinize your case and is going to ask you this question that why did you take this 20%, why did you not take it as 10%, then you will find yourself in a problem. So personally what I do, I basically cannot justify this number. So I don't take it. Yes, Zian, you reduce it over here after equity value. So that's why I don't take it. And in fact, in one of the conversations which I had with the other valuation experts as well, they were also of the similar opinion. Theoretically, if you open the book, you will get a formula for DLOM, DLOC, etc. But no book will be talking about the basis that is used or an objective approach to be used for all. Because there's no standard for it. You might say this is illiquid, but somebody else would say that this is pretty liquid, because we have so many people standing in the market who are looking to buy this company. So how do you say that it is illiquid? Though it is not listed on stock exchange, it is still liquid. And at the same time, there are so many companies which are listed on stock exchange, but the volume is so less that you can't really say that it is liquid. There also you might want to apply discount for lack of lesser volume, right? So this is how you do. Come back to this cost of equities. Instead of taking 12%, I would take 14% and then replace it. Obviously, this is going to reduce the value. That's another thing that you could do. Right. So this is the adjusted cost of equity. And if you want, instead of using the pure CAPM, you could call this 14% over here, and this 1979, you would see it reduces, because now you have a higher cost of equity. And you know what venture capitalists do? They basically increase it to roughly about 5-7%, as I said before. They keep on declining the value. For the amount that they're putting in, they want to take higher stakes. That's why they keep on taking a higher premium. And it happens out there. They take some extra premium because they say that we are taking additional risk, so we need extra premium for it. So that's it from my side. I hope I've been able to cover the pointers that we discussed yesterday. And as always, I'm going to save this file in the same folder from where you can download and keep a copy of it. That folder will be accessible for some more time. So please, after end of session today, download all the files in your machines so that you have it handy with you in future. Some books, as I said, Aswad Damodaran has this book called Valuation by Damodaran and Investment Valuation by Damodaran. There is one book called Dark Side of Valuation. These two books are pretty good. Damodaran you will easily find if I show you Valuation by Damodaran. Damodaran on valuation. Here it is. So Damodaran on valuation is a very nice book. So if you want, you can actually check this book. I think it's about a 30-page book, covers each and every aspect in detail, covering the examples of the industries and also some case studies on the company's part, how you basically arrive at all of these values. Whatever I've discussed, basically, you would find all of that in this book. Like 697 pages available, or maybe 697 pages. Right? This is a nice book. Otherwise, the other book, if you like reading some sort of a stories and then want to connect it to the valuation, there is Dark Side of Valuation, which basically talks about the issues related to the young companies, the startup companies, and some distressed businesses. This is also a pretty nice book. But obviously, before going to this book, I would recommend that you go for the basic book, which is Damodaran on Valuation, which talks about the basics of it. All right. So that's it from my side for today. And I hope you have been able to, I've been able to achieve the objective that I discussed right on the day one. Thank you very much, and we'll stay connected for any questions in future. As I said, please reach out to the GT admin team. They should be able to address your additional questions that you may have on this. Right? Thank you very much. Have a great evening and download the file from the folder over there. Bye-bye.